From refugees fleeing conflict and oppression to rising extremism and a possible British exit, the European Union is facing enormous challenges. Can it survive? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Terrorism in Paris and Brussels and a massive refugee crisis have dominated the headlines, but those are only a few of the daunting challenges facing the European Union. As Europe continues to recover from the longest recession in its history, overexpansion, instability in Ukraine, the Greek economy, rising nationalism, and a possible exit by Britain are some of the other issues facing the 28 member states. The question is, do EU countries still share the values that first brought them together? Later we'll talk with the former ambassador for the European Union, but we begin in Berlin with CCTV's Guy Henderson. And Guy, I mentioned a few of those challenges. Put them in perspective for us. What are some of the more formidable challenges facing the EU, and how do they get resolved?
Well, I think one of the interesting things to note about that long list of crises that at times you wonder whether Europe is being slightly overwhelmed by is the extent to which many people would feel that they are to some extent linked. So you talked, for example, about the rise in nationalism. That's something we've seen here in Germany in the last few weeks or so. Important state elections here in which a right-wing anti-immigration party won big gains. In one state it became the second largest party in that state. Now, part of the reason for that, is of course the huge influx of refugees coming to Europe at the moment. The next question then, of course, is why are so many refugees coming to Europe at the moment? Well, that is down to a changing international environment, an increasing number of conflicts around Europe's borders. From Syria, we've seen again a flare-up in tensions between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Don't forget the conflict in Yemen. No large influx of refugees there yet, but certainly fears about that. And then North Africa as well, and particularly Libya is of a primary concern to European leaders at the moment. Various diplomatic processes underway to try and bring some semblance of peace to regions like that. And certainly the internationalist perspective on this would be that if you're able to solve one of the problems along that long chain, you therefore potentially improve the chances of solving some of the other items on that list as well.
So certainly a lot of stresses on the EU right now. What might the Union look like several years from now?
Well, that is the trillion-dollar question, perhaps more. A very difficult question to answer with any certainty. What I can perhaps give you is a summary, or some of a summary of the various schools of thought on that issue. Now, it's not uncommon these days to hear people talk about Europe's facing an existential crisis, a threat to its very existence at the moment. But I think it's important to point out that that isn't widely seen as a complete disintegration of the EU or a threat of, but more a change of the EU from its current form. Now, of course, the dominant debate at the moment is about whether various countries, including the UK, as you've mentioned, might soon look to leave the European Union. But it's important to note in the longer term that it is actually still possible that there'll be expansion. There are a number of countries from Iceland to the Balkans to Turkey that are in the process of negotiating entering the European Union, not leaving it. Another debate that is particularly forceful at the moment, given this number of crises, is the structure that the EU might take. So in Germany, for example, furious debate here, and this is certainly the heart of the argument, which says that the reason that the European Union is suffering all these crises at the moment is because it's not integrated enough. On the other hand, you have countries like the United Kingdom, more Eurosceptic countries like Denmark, for example, whose citizens and voters, or at least perhaps a good number of its citizens and voters, might say that that's impossible, and that there should at least be several speed system in the European Union, where different countries can opt out of essentially measures on immigration, taxing, foreign policy, intelligence sharing, that they perhaps have more reservations about. But forecasting, as you know, I'm sure it is extremely difficult. Those are just some of the debates and scenarios that are being floated around here.
Thanks, Guy. That's CCTV's Guy Henderson reporting from Berlin. John Bruton was first elected to the Irish Parliament at the age of 22. He went on to serve as the country's Prime Minister and the European Union's ambassador to the United States. He joins us now from Ireland. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you.
So, Prime Minister, the European Union, as we know, is facing some very steep challenges right now. The migrant refugee crisis, the Greek debt crisis, a British referendum, plus issues with Russia, as well as the rise of extremism in Europe. Why are European nations finding it so difficult to find a common position on these issues?
Well, the European Union is a gathering together of 28 sovereign states who in some areas cooperate under a legal agreement, but in other areas they have no agreement. And the issue of refugees, for example, is one where there is no formal legal basis for the European Union requiring its members to take a given number of refugees. So they have to work by persuasion. And that's obviously quite difficult. A union of 28 sovereign states can't act as quickly as, say, the United States could, where it is a federal state with central powers.
I understand the legal aspects of that, but what about the spirit of the agreement, the spirit of the union? Should they not be acting in unison?
They should, and I think we have, each of the 28 states in the European Union has a clear obligation, for example, to take refugees. That's something that dates back to the aftermath of the Second World War, the International Refugee Conventions, which require us to give shelter to people who are fleeing imminent death because of war. And there's no doubt that people who are fleeing from Syria are fleeing the possibility of imminent death. That isn't true of immigrants coming from other countries, but from Syria that certainly is the case, and we have an obligation to provide shelter for them. What's happening, of course, is that they're arriving in Greece and they're not being shared out among the 28 countries. Germany, generously, in my view, has agreed to take quite a substantial number, but there are other countries who are taking none at all, and the United Kingdom is not part of the arrangements and it's not taking any either. So that means that there isn't a proper sharing of the burden or responsibility of taking in refugees among the 28 member states. And that's something which the Union is working hard to resolve, but because of the nature of the Union, it's a slow process.
Is that search for a common policy going to get any easier in the years ahead, or is there a danger that the European Union could one day become a very loose confederation of states with perhaps regional powers acting in their own interests? How does it overcome this challenge?
Well, the European Union was set up precisely to avoid that situation where you had powers acting in their own interests, a balance of power situation in Europe which gave us 2 or 3 major wars over the last 150 years. The European Union was set up over 50 years ago to ensure that we never went back to that. And that's one of the reasons why it's very regrettable that the United Kingdom, which has been involved in protecting democracy in Europe in the past, in Poland and in Belgium earlier, is now wanting or considering whether it might opt out of the European Union altogether. The fact is, what happens in one part of Europe affects all who live elsewhere in Europe. And we have to. It's a practical requirement that we cooperate. And the European Union is the means we have of doing it. Therefore, I think we need to deal with issues like refugees. We need to deal with issues like better intelligence sharing to counter terrorism. We need to act together to protect the sovereignty of our member states if that's threatened, for example, as you suggested in one of your questions, by Russia.
With the United Kingdom playing such an important role in the European Union, as you've pointed out, can Europe survive if Britain leaves the Union?
Well, if Britain is looking at this, it seems to me, following the debate, living in Ireland, I'm able to follow the debate in the UK quite closely. They're looking at this as if this was a freestanding decision that they can make for themselves and that they have no responsibility for the effects that that might have. Well, now, if Britain leaves the European Union, that would be the first case of a country leaving the European Union. Well, Greenland, after 6 years long negotiation as part of Denmark, left the European Union, but her full state has never left the European Union before, and that would, I think, do a lot of damage to the structure of peace and security that we built up in Europe. I don't think it would serve Britain's interests. Nobody knows what sort of new arrangement, if there would be a new arrangement, between a Britain outside the European Union and the European Union would be. Ireland, where I live, would be dramatically affected because we would then become, as a European Union country, having a land border with a country that had left the European Union, the United Kingdom, in Northern Ireland. So we might have to erect customs posts, passport controls, all sorts of things would have to be done in Ireland that would adversely affect the peace process, for example, that we built up, which has reconciled conflicts that had existed and caused so much bloodshed on the island of Ireland in the past.
Now, that referendum on British membership is going to be held in June. The British Prime Minister David Cameron has been able to negotiate some concessions from the European Union. Do you think that that's going to be enough to keep Britain in the Union?
Well, those concessions are very minor in my view. They would slow down, in fact, rather than speed up the decision-making in the European Union by introducing new hurdles which would have to be crossed for certain EU rules to be adopted. But if that's what he feels he needs to persuade his electorate, it's probably good that he has been given whatever he feels he needs. But the truth of the matter is that the real issue is, can Britain influence its own future and influence the world around it better by being in a European Union with 27 other member states, or can it do the job better on its own? I believe it can do the job much better in the European Union. If it is on its own, it will have to renegotiate all its trade agreements, not just with the European Union, but with all the other countries which are now trading with Britain as part of the European Union. Those agreements would be gone and would have to be replaced. We could have years and years of uncertainty about trade flows and the export of services affecting the United Kingdom, which would be extremely bad for investment in the United Kingdom, but also extremely bad for investment in Europe as a whole.
Another issue that placed great strains on the European Union was the Greek debt crisis. How was that handled, in your view? Was this a case of richer, bigger countries in the EU basically imposing their will on a poorer nation?
Well, Greece did borrow the money. It was, for many years, spending more, paying pensions earlier, and raising less tax or not collecting tax properly. And it was bridging the gap between spending and tax receipts by borrowing. Gradually, that borrowing reached a point where Greece could no longer borrow. Lenders were not prepared to lend to it. So what happened was that the taxpayers of other Eurozone countries, not Britain, but the Eurozone countries, stepped in and they said, well, we'll lend you the money. Our taxpayers will lend you the money. But obviously, if you are borrowing money from the taxpayers of another country, it's not unreasonable that the governments of those other countries would want to impose certain conditions to ensure that you did everything you could do to pay, or to put yourself in a position to pay that money back. And that's what's going on with Greece. Greece has made very many reforms, but there are some worries that it hasn't gone far enough, for example, in its pension reforms. For instance, people could retire in Greece much younger, at a much younger age than they could retire in Germany. And that obviously caused certain aggravation to German taxpayers who are saying, well, the Greeks want some of their debts that they owe to us written off, but they're still paying themselves pensions at a younger age than one can qualify for a pension in Germany. So those sorts of changes are having to be made by the Greeks. I think it's not unreasonable.
And if we look at the migrant or refugee or asylum crisis, we see very different responses from the older members of the European Union, countries like Germany, France, Italy, and the newer members like Hungary, Poland, the Baltic states. And when we look at the way in which these different sets of countries look at the same problem, are they, in effect, two Europes that we're talking about here?
I think there's more than two. I think not all of the older members are being as forthright and forthcoming as Germany is being in accepting refugees from Syria. For instance, I'm not aware that any refugees from Syria have so far come to Ireland or to Britain. Not too many have gone to France either. Germany, on the other hand, is offering asylum to people from Syria. It's going to obviously be a big challenge. On the other hand, many of these people are very well educated and could make a very valuable contribution to the German economy. And in the medium to long term, Europe is going to have a major labour shortage. We're not going to have enough people of working age earning money to pay the pensions that we will be wanting to pay in future to the very large number of people who will have passed retirement age. So we need in Europe to bring in younger people of working age from outside. So this could be an opportunity as much as a problem.
Prime Minister, thank you so much for joining us. We are going to take a break right now. When we come back, what changes could we see to the European Union? We'll ask our panel. That's next. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. We're talking about the challenges facing the European Union. Joining us from Rome is John Hooper, a former Southern Europe editor for The Guardian and Observer newspapers. He's currently a correspondent for The Economist news magazine. And Philippe Lamberts is one of Belgium's representatives to the European Parliament. He joins us from Brussels. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Philippe, let me start with you. There's a debate going on right now about the future of the European Union. We hear about Britain wanting to withdraw from the Union. There's pressure on the common currency, the euro. There's a new Europe versus an old Europe. Do you believe that the European Union is still a union, or do we see states, individual states, or groups of states increasingly acting in their own interest?
Well, indeed, we see a rising sentiment from various quarters in Europe that individual member states would be stronger on their own. I strongly doubt, of course, this approach. Let's look at the world map. Europeans represent 7% of the global population altogether. Sitting on 2.2% of the land of this planet, it's quite obvious that the only way for a European to weigh not just on their own affairs, but in the world affairs, is to act together. But that sentiment is receding, certainly in some quarters of our public opinion, but by and large in a significant part of the political leadership in Europe, and witnessed the recent refugee crisis where the initiative of Chancellor Merkel to open the doors to war refugees from Syria and elsewhere has not been met with corresponding moves by other member states, including France, for instance. So whereas together we have capabilities, when we are acting individually, we are considerably weaker, and that leads Europe basically then to have to make deals with the likes of Erdogan of Turkey, so as to remedy the fact that we are unable to act together. So yes, the Union is at risk at the moment, and we should not underestimate that.
John, where do you see Europe heading? You know, when we look at some of the issues that Philippe just talked about there, the fact that there's very little cooperation among intelligence agencies in Europe in combating terrorism, and if we look at some of the issues that has put enormous strains on the alliance, the Greek debt crisis for one, the migrant crisis for another, where do you see Europe going?
Well, I see a split two ways, really. I mean, one is between creditor and debtor countries, where the line runs pretty much east to west, separating north from south. And then another line at right angles, which has been brought to light by the migrant crisis, splitting Western Europe, where there are generally, though certainly not universally, tolerant attitudes, from those that prevail in the east of Europe, where there has been really stiff resistance to any kind of sharing of the burden put on the European Union by the refugee crisis originating in Syria. So a pretty chronic situation in which there is more than one fracture inside this Union, and there may yet be a third, of course, because of my own country holding a referendum on whether to stay in the European Union, something which, if it goes the way of leaving, could spark off similar thoughts and referenda in other parts of Europe.
And Philippe, sometimes these pressures on the European Union have unintended consequences. I mean, we're seeing, for instance, the migrant refugee crisis in Europe has led to the rise of extremist groups across Europe. This policy, I mean, the fact that refugees are coming to Europe appears to be fueling extremist politics. In many instances, we see hard right parties gaining more support in many countries. How big a problem is that for the alliance?
Well, it's a rising problem. I would say it was already there before the refugee crisis, but of course the refugee crisis fueled it and gave it ammunition going forward. Yes, it is a threat, but it has become bigger, not just because of the refugee crisis. Basically, the impression that our citizens are increasingly having is that, well, if you elect a mainstream right government or a mainstream left government, basically you get the same policies, which are the traditional pro-market neoliberal policies. Hence, a number of people who feel left behind, and don't forget that 25% of Europeans are at risk of poverty and social exclusion, well, those left behinds may then turn to alternative parties, which can be in a limited way at the extreme left and in a more numerical strong way at the extreme right. So if we could deprive those extreme right parties from the segment of their electorate that comes to them not because they are racist but because they are destitute, then we could really actively fight those parties. But there seems to be an ignorance in the mainstream parties of that factor, and that's certainly the case in France. A significant part of the extreme right electorate is actually coming from the left, from people from popular quarters who feel cheated by the traditional left parties. And if they had done their job, then maybe Marine Le Pen would not have such a success today.
And John, are we also seeing that external pressures on the European Union are compromising or diluting some very cherished European ideals, things like a common currency? I mean, during the Greek debt crisis, there was talk at one stage of Greece going its own way, of adopting the drachma as its currency, its old currency again. There is also the common border, and we are seeing some countries now, in the face of the terrorist threat, reimpose internal border controls. The borders are going back up. So these cherished ideals that I'm talking about, are they being compromised here? Are they being diluted?
Yes, they are, unquestionably. This is as much a crisis of values as anything else in Europe. When you see the European Union, for example, cutting a deal with a country like Turkey, which of late has seen quite blatant abuses of the right to a free press, in order to solve its problem with refugees, then clearly you are in a crisis of values. And that, I think, began, you mentioned earlier on, the Greek crisis and the possibility of letting Greece go. I think it brought to light the speed with which the European Union has expanded over recent years. And I think it's brought into question whether, in fact, that expansion was too rapid. Both the inclusion of Greece in the single currency and also the inclusion of countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, that clearly have big questions about the values that have been regarded up until now as European, but really are turning out in many cases to be largely Western European values.
Philippe, what is your view in that? Did the European Union expand too quickly, and as a result, are we seeing two Europes right now, or as the former Irish Prime Minister told us a moment ago, more than two Europes, many Europes acting in their own interest? And for instance, on the immigrant crisis, we get the new European countries like Hungary and Poland acting in one way, and old Europe, represented by countries like Germany and Italy and France, acting in another.
Well, it would be interesting to have such groupings, but I do not see, for instance, these Western European countries like Italy, France, and Germany acting in concert. If you look closely at their relationships, you see France letting down Germany on the refugee crisis. You see France letting down also Italy on the refugee crisis. You see Germany trying to impose its own style of economic policy on Italy. So actually, I do not see a coalition of, say, federalist member states who would want to move forward compared to other member states that would be, say, more nationalist. What I see is basically a group of 28 countries, each trying to fend for itself. And that, to me, is a crisis not just of values, which is, and I totally agree with what you just said, but also a crisis of lack of vision. That as if any member state, including the largest ones, could be able to have more sovereignty on their own rather than to have it shared with others in order to weigh more. Now, did we expand too fast? Actually, when you look at the delay it took from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the unification, it was 15 years, which is actually already quite a lot of time. Now, it's true that we assembled countries that had very different traditions and only very recent democracies in some cases, including Greece, by the way, which has been ruled by a dictatorship until 1974. So yes, we did expand probably too fast and before making the institutions able to work with 28 member states, which is more complex than when you have only a dozen. Nevertheless, I think that it was also a question of the ability of Europeans to face globalization.
And John, when it comes to foreign policy, I mean, we're talking about 28 countries here, 28 sovereign countries. Is it too much to ask them to have a common foreign policy? We saw that, for instance, during the Ukraine crisis, when Russia annexed Crimea and then expressed support for separatists in Ukraine. The European Union joined the United States in imposing sanctions on Russia, but those sanctions affected different countries differently. And I'm wondering, how much pressure does that put on solidarity in Europe?
A great deal. Unquestionably, foreign policy is one of those areas where Europeans have found it most difficult to align their interests, because the interests in many cases are, as you say, intrinsically different. Having said that, I think that what Mr. Lambert said is in many ways correct, that what we've seen is a lag of the political side compared to the economic side, and this really goes back to the very origins of the European Union, the so-called money method. In other words, that you give people self-interest through economic unification, and gradually the political self-interest will come through, or the political unification will come through. And that's really been proved not to be the case. There is a broad area of economic self-interest which is well aligned. What we don't have is the alignment of political interest that's necessary, for example, to have a common foreign policy. And that really now, I think, is the challenge for Europe. And I think that in order to build it, then first of all, I think a lot of eggs are going to be smashed in making that omelette, if it ever does get made. And secondly, some countries, I think, will be lost along the way.
And that's where we have to leave it. John Hooper in Rome, Philippe Lamberts in Brussels. Thanks to both of you for joining us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.